Hi folks, you're with Tastus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live chat. And in this stream, I'd like to talk about feudalism and a return to feudalism, how it appears as international events are unfolding, particularly the economy of the West, that we're returning to a feudal society. Now, I suppose defining feudalism, if we look at the medieval times of feudalism and serfdom, which is kind of a word for peasants, indentured peasants, we had the land, and say look at somewhere like Britain in the Middle Ages, but this could apply to anywhere, France and Spain and so on. The land was owned by about 600 families or people thereabouts, and the rest of the population worked on that land as labourers, and the landowner or the aristocrat or the lord or whatever you want to call it, they would own all the land, and they would own all the proper houses and dwellings and everything on the land. And so the serfs owned nothing other than possibly their clothes or something they may have made in their own time. But they lived in the houses that were owned by the aristocrat. They tilled the land that was owned by the aristocrat. They used the mills and the threshing machines and the water wheels and the roads or the tracks, as they would have been. All the carts used for haulage, to say the markets, for example. Everything was owned by the aristocrat. Now, you may have a one-off situation where somebody might own one cow, for example, but they would work the land, and it was one of a number of systems, I guess. One was where the peasants would work the land in a sort of a semi-communal sense, and then the aristocrat would then portion out some of the crops that were harvested, would portion them out to the peasants as food and so on. So there'd be the vegetables, maybe some meat, milk, cheese, butter, that sort of stuff. So that would all go. The other way was that the peasant would have a certain area of the land that they were to work, and they would give a proportion of all the harvest to the aristocrat. So the aristocrat may take, for example, half or three quarters or whatever, and then the peasant could keep the rest. The other way was the peasant would have their own plot of land, which was for their own survival and feeding themselves. And then they would have to work 2 or 3 days a week on the aristocrat's land, which would be the bigger portion. So they either gave their labour or they gave the portion of the crops that they'd harvested from the land. So there were those different ways. Now the aristocrat was able to sort of claw back really a lot of the the crops that the peasant might keep. So the peasant wanted to, for example, grind the wheat, so they could the flour, so they could make bread. The aristocrat had a monopoly on everything there. So the big windmill that would turn the grinding wheel, or the water wheel that would turn the grinding stone and that sort of thing, that was all owned by the aristocrat. So if the peasant wanted to grind their grain, they had to go to the aristocrat, who would charge sort of monopoly rates, and so, well, you can grind your corn here, but I'm going to take half of it if you want to use the grain. So there were those, or if you want to take your grain or your vegetables, whatever it was, to the local town market, then you had to use the horse and cart that the aristocrat owned. So then that had to be, the aristocrat would then take a piece of the action from that, or you'd use the road, or in the earlier days, the turnpike, as they would call it, and then you had to pay a fee for using that. Or if there were lots of goons or heavies or robbers or thieves in the neighbourhood, then you'd go to the aristocrat and say, well, I need a couple of your soldiers to escort us to the marketplace, then you had to pay for that, and so there's a huge array of clawbacks that the aristocrat could use. So the peasant was not going to do too well of it. Now, there was no point in the aristocrat making sure the peasants were so poor and emaciated and tired and exhausted and undernourished that they couldn't do any work. That wouldn't achieve anything. So the aristocrat was responsible for providing housing for the peasants and making sure they had just enough to live and just enough to get by. So that was really the arrangement of the feudal times. That meant that the peasant, the aristocrat had complete control of things, and the peasant merely existed day to day at the pleasure of the aristocrat. So that they were just tax and labour cattle in effect, and that was how it was. Now things changed in during the agricultural revolution and the advanced stage of the mercantile age, and of course in the industrial revolution, particularly the industrial revolution. So that took people off the land and into the factories and getting well-paid, stable, sort of long-term jobs, and that changed everything. And the entire Western society, of course, changed economically and socially and even culturally as a result of it. Now we're coming down the other side of the mountain where it appears, at least, we're returning to feudalism. Now, why do I say that? It's because the amount of jobs that pay what we would call the independent middle class lifestyle, from nearly all full-time jobs in 1970, say, to now a decreasing proportion of full-time jobs. So by 1996, 25% from 70% of jobs, full-time jobs, paying middle-class lifestyle, it had fallen to 25%. So, and then it's fallen again. And now in the big cities, the big international cities like percent, and then it's fallen again. And now in the big cities, the big international Sydney and London and so on, you've got to really go out into the far outer suburbs before even two middle class incomes can afford to live. So you're looking in say Sydney. I mean, just to sort of give you some numbers here, the top 1% of incomes in Australia are I think the cut-off point's about 240,000 Australian dollars a year, and once you pass that threshold, you're in the top 1%. So say give or take 130,000 people have it, and most of those are clustered at the bottom end. So I would say between 240 and 250,000 a year. So let's take 250 as just an example. As soon as you get to sort of double $500,000 a year, you're down to a very small number of people. And if you get into the big end of town, like $1 million a year, then I think only 20-odd thousand people are pulling those sort of bucks in the entire country of Australia. So it'll give you an idea where the money is dispersing there. But stay on $250,000 a year and buying what would be an average middle of the middle class, so you're talking sort of middle bucks, and say $250,000 annual income. Now, if you look at assuming the person's got no dependents and no children and no additional costs, they're not still paying off, college loans or something like that. Assuming all the income's theirs, after tax and social security and those sort of deductions, they're going to be left with ballpark 120,000. So out of that, they've got to pay back that loan. Now, if they're quite disciplined, they live carefully and prudently, they could pay off that house in 25 years with that sort of, but they'd have to almost be frugal with their, that assumes they don't lose their jobs, they've got absolutely continuous employment, they don't get sick or injured, or that assumes nothing. If you look at, say, two income earners that are making, for example, $125,000 each, and there's still not that many of them in the overall scheme of things, then provided they don't have children, again, don't get sick, don't stop work, They don't have to do any major renovations on the house. They've got one car, and it's about that. Very disciplined, very focused, very tight. Then they could do it as well. But that shows just how tight it is, even at the top end of the incomes. So more and more people are falling into what's known as subsistence income, where, like the farmers of old, people are falling into what's known as subsistence income, where, like the farmers of old, where they've just got enough food to get by. These people, of course, aren't working on farms now in the big cities. They're making just enough income to get by. Getting sick or losing their job or getting laid off or something like that. This is really going to make it tight for them. It's going to be a close. So the only way they can bridge the difference is by credit. They've got to borrow money, and the amount of people who've got numerous credit cards, whether excuse me, they just do a round robin of paying one credit card to the next, and in this endless cycle, where you know at some point they're going to collapse in a screaming heap. But this is the sort of life economically and socially that's being thrust on the Western population by the globalisation. And the globalisation is doing, of course, two things. It's sending the well-paying job fast. It doesn't need any of my rhetoric to help it along. It's already very close. And I don't see any signs that the media are controlled by the globalists and just spew endless globalist talking points. The body politic all across the Western world is controlled by the globalists, and whatever the globalists want, they're going to impose. And they see this somehow in their interests. And while there's a reduction in Western purchasing power in terms of consumer goods, they'll be able to rechannel their taxes they pay right back into their own pockets using this method. So they're just really moving the deck chairs around and moving the problems around and then moving the benefits around and so on to suit themselves. So that's where I see it going. But I'd like to see your comments on this, and maybe I'm being too dystopian, maybe not dystopian enough. But that's what I see happening. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining.